This is Alan Schwartz for the New York Times. In the late 90s, the FDA allowed the advertising of controlled substances directly to consumers. Pharmaceutical companies jumped at the chance to market medication to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Since then, ADHD diagnoses have become so common that now 1 in 7 high school students in the United States has been told they have the condition. Some experts are worried that parents are being driven to their doctors.
You're getting calls from his teacher. He's impulsive in class. And his inattention makes focusing on homework tough.
ADHD is a real clinical problem. I think that at the same time, there is recognition that ADHD medications are overused.
Harvard professor Dr. Aaron Kesselheim studies pharmaceutical marketing and ethics. He discussed what makes ADHD ads so effective.
So I think as a patient or as a consumer, you see a perfectly balanced child who is both academically and athletically gifted. You see words like potential jump out at you and academic performance. And you see this background of these neurons so that you think that there is some science behind it. You know, I think that a lot of these quotes play on common fears and concerns that parents have about their children, that they're not socialized enough or they're not emphasizing their homework. You know, there aren't a lot of 8-year-olds out there who look forward to doing their homework. One of the fundamental characteristics of pharmaceutical advertising is that they tend to overestimate the benefits of the products and underestimate the risks. And one of the ways they do that is through adjustment of the fonts and placement of the material on the page, so that the benefits tend to be on the top of the page and the risks tend to be at the bottom of the page because people read from the top to the bottom. You know, it plays on the parents' normal considerations that sometimes their kids can be monsters, but that at their core they love them, and you want to be interacting with that lovable kid inside rather than the monster that your 8-year-old son can sometimes be.
After the doctor diagnosed my son with ADHD, I knew treatment was the right thing to do.
Some of the ways that pharmaceutical companies sell their product is by informing people about the condition. It isn't selling a particular drug, but experts say these kinds of marketing videos lead people to ask for medication.
There's good news. The American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines recommend stimulant medications to treat ADHD. Certain types of these ADHD medications have been safely and widely used for over 40 years.
They talked about stimulant medications being safe and effective for decades. They were not under any obligation to mention any risks of that medication.
Right, because they didn't mention the specific drug, so they don't have to mention the specific risks. So what you got there was 30 seconds of how wonderful stimulant medications are, and very soft music and pleasing shots of the countryside that it leads to a lot of positive associations. I think it is misleading for a company to mention the benefits of a class of products without mentioning the common risks of those class of products and the positive outcomes that pharmacotherapy can have without mentioning the risks or the alternatives to pharmacotherapy that exist for treatment of this condition.
Vyvanse helps control my ADHD. That's it.
Diagnoses of adult ADHD are now rising as fast as children's did a decade ago. In the past several years, ADHD in adults has been recognized as a treatable condition. Marketing efforts have followed.
It was my ADHD, and like many kids with ADHD, I didn't outgrow it.
But questions remain about how often the disorder is misdiagnosed and the role that pharmaceutical marketing continues to play.
New figures point to a continuing rise in ADHD among American kids. I'm David Gillen for the New York Times. Times health reporter Alan Schwartz is here to discuss ADHD and the drugs used to treat it. Hey, Alan, thanks for coming in.
Nice to see you.
So I was amazed by this. These are new figures from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. Nearly 1 in 5 high school-age boys in the U.S. and roughly 1 in 10 kids overall have been diagnosed with ADHD. Historically, this is like 3 to 7%. So what's going on here? Do more kids have ADHD, or are we just diagnosing it more?
Well, it depends how you define ADHD.
Okay.
Some, environmental factors such as video games, single-parent homes, and whatever can result in more ADHD behaviors. But I think that what most people believe is happening is doctors are just more readily diagnosing ADHD in kids with relatively minor symptoms.
Right. Let's talk, we've been talking about this for more than a decade now. I mean, I was trying to check when Ritalin Nation was published. I think it was 2000. But let's talk about Ritalin and Adderall and the other stimulants that are used to treat ADHD. How much more of these drugs are being prescribed then?
Well, the annual sales have gone up to $9 billion in the last 5 years, after it was $4 billion 5 years ago. So that gives you an idea. The number of prescriptions is going way up, particularly among adolescents and young adults.
Right. Now, you've written in the past for the Times, we were talking about this just before we started here, how some kids and perhaps even some of their parents are using these drugs essentially as performance-enhancing drugs. You've got a test, you've got the SATs or whatever. I mean, are doctors worried about that? The doctors that you've talked to, I mean, what are they saying about the rise in prescriptions and the possible sort of off-label use, or what you will?
Some doctors are concerned.
Right.
Okay. Other doctors appear to be relatively oblivious to that kind of use of these medications.
Now, you mentioned that, in fact, the criteria, the definition of what is ADHD is about to be changed, and that, in fact, could lead to even more diagnoses of this disorder. So they're loosening the standards, essentially? Is that what's happening, or broadening it?
Yes, they want to make sure they are as inclusive as possible. The definition of ADHD for many years was written in a way that it sounded more like a young child's disorder. Can't sit still in class, things like that, which sound as if an adult doesn't have it, or a young adult, or an adolescent. And they wanted to make sure that as many adolescents, or there were none that were excluded because of the wording of the definition. I think that these new numbers, which have never been seen before, 1 in 5 high school boys are getting diagnosed. It's hard, I think, to argue that there are a lot of undiagnosed kids running around. I mean, how high should it be?
Right.
And so the question becomes, if there are a lot of kids running around with it, that means that the ones they're diagnosing are the wrong ones.
Right.
And that's where things get, of great concern.
Alan, what are parents supposed to do then? I mean, what are parents supposed to do? All of us, have at times been tempted. You've got a fidgety kid or whatever. You just, you think, oh my God, maybe we could just do this, take a pill, it'll be easier. But what do you do?
It's very, very hard. I mean, who doesn't think that their kid has ADHD from time to time? Right. I mean, of course, we all do. Right. I have a 6-year-old, but one needs to be careful. What's the difference between impairment, which has historically at least been the bar for really considering a diagnosis? What's the difference between impairment and inconvenience? Right. Okay? I mean, it's a subtle distinction sometimes, but it's one that I think we as a society need to talk about and decide, is this what we want for kids, for the next generation?